Hello everybody, welcome to the Washington Times for this special episode of History as It Happens. I'm Martin DeCaro. November 22nd, 1963 is a very dark day etched in the memories of every American who is old enough to remember it. The day John F. Kennedy was assassinated at the age of 46 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Less well known is what happened on November 2nd, 1963, just a few weeks beforehand in South Vietnam. The autocratic president of that American ally, Ngo Dinh Diem, was toppled in a coup d'etat and then murdered by the plotters. And because of the remarkable work of our guest here today, we now have a clearer idea, I would even say an entirely clear idea, of JFK's role in that drama in South Vietnam, in that coup and assassination. Ken Hughes, welcome back. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, now I'm going to pummel you with questions for about an hour.
That's fair.
Ken Hughes, researcher, historian at the Miller Center, which is a great resource, by the way, at the University of Virginia. You are also the author of a couple of other books dealing with White House presidential tapes. We have Fatal Politics and Chasing Shadows. I almost flubbed the titles there. I could have said...
I do too.
Yeah, Chasing Politics now. Chasing Shadows and Fatal Politics, which are about the Nixon years. They deal with Watergate and Vietnam. These are terrific books. Thank you for not writing 1,000-page books. I would not be able to balance them on my lap here, but they're not easy books, and I mean that in a good way. They have to be read very carefully because of your work as a researcher. Before we dive into the history here of Kennedy and Diem in South Vietnam, I want to just familiarize our audience a little bit with the work you do. You've been called the master of the White House tapes. What do you do?
I basically do a job that most people don't want to do. I listen to the White House tapes, started with Richard Nixon's, which were the most voluminous. He recorded 3,700 hours of White House conversations, but also Lyndon Johnson's, which people are familiar with from C-SPAN,
yeah.
and John F. Kennedy's. He was the one who really started taping in depth. We got about 250 or 260 hours of the Kennedy administration on tape.
And those are the three presidents who had a recording system, right? Kennedy,
yes.
Johnson, Nixon. That's pretty much it.
They were the ones who recorded the most. A few other presidents recorded a little. We've done some with FDR, who's fascinating. Some with Ronald Reagan, who just recorded a few of his international conversations in the Situation Room or through the Situation Room. So, those are the big three. Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon.
I guess all presidents after Nixon realized it's not such a good idea to have a record of what you're doing back there.
Yes, Nixon ruined it for the presidents, the historians of the presidents afterwards, because he lost his job because his tapes captured too much history that otherwise would have vanished.
Yeah, it's not a good thing for society, really, not just historians like yourself. For all of us, we want to have an irrefutable record of what presidents have decided and have said behind closed doors. It's great, right? It opens a window into what Kennedy was thinking, LBJ, Nixon. I don't even know what we'll be dealing with in the future. Emails and text messages, I guess.
Yes, I imagine.
Well, we're going to talk about what happened on November 22nd, the assassination of an American president and the Kennedy mystique, the darker side of Camelot, but we're also going to talk more. Really, we're going to start with what happened in South Vietnam in earlier November, really all through that summer of 1963. How did Kennedy set up his taping system?
He did it in '62. He did it for the same reason that other presidents did. He thought he had been misquoted, misrepresented. And so he had a Secret Service technician named Robert Bauch basically bug the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room. He had microphones hidden under the surface of the Resolute desk in what looked like a buzzer box on the coffee table in the Oval Office between the two big white sofas that he had his guests sit in when he sat in his rocking chair. And also hidden behind the curtains in the cabinet room in
Oh, wow.
in lamp sconces.
So did the people who come in to speak to him, did they know they were being recorded?
They had no idea, and he did not tell him. It was a very, very well-guarded secret. He activated the tapes by pushing a button that looked like a buzzer. So they would think he was calling for a secretary or an aide.
How about that?
But it would actually start a reel-to-reel tape recorder spinning in the basement of the White House.
How about that? You know, I learned how to edit audio as a young radio reporter on reel-to-reel.
Me too.
I know, I broke in right before the digital stuff started. Thankfully, it saves a lot of time, although I still work just as much as I used to. I said I was going to get into what happened in '63 in the summer through the fall in Saigon and Washington. But just one other question about the work you do, since I asked you about how Kennedy set up the taping system. The audio on these tapes often is not very clear. You spend hours and hours and hours listening to this, transcribing it, trying to make sense of it. It's a difficult task just from a technological point of view.
Yeah, and I definitely don't do it alone. We have at least 4 scholars go over every tape independently, and all we're doing is looking for one another's mistakes. And that's a good thing, because everybody makes mistakes. We found that like professional transcribers, people like court stenographers, who have to give absolutely accurate records, were baffled by the White House tapes, mainly because they didn't know what they were talking about. These are all old, obscure political and strategic issues.
I've listened to some of the XCOM tapes. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis with Kennedy. You know, it's like a speakerphone somewhere, or a microphone that's far away from the table. The Nixon tapes, for instance, it'll sound like Kissinger's right in front of the microphone and Nixon's far off, and you can't always understand what he's saying. It's echoey, they talk over each other, but quite a task, quite a task. So, all right, let's start talking about our main focus here. The not-so-remembered assassination just 20 days before Kennedy himself would be murdered in Dallas. You've shown definitively what Kennedy's role here was in the coup d'etat of Ngo Dinh Diem. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. In South Vietnam, based on new evidence. Obviously, the White House tapes are the new evidence. Anything else that you've come across as a researcher that had been hidden prior to this?
Well, the JFK Assassination Records Review Board was a treasure trove of classified information. As you know, Congress set that up because conspiracy theorists were basically excited by Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and that got enough people interested in getting out every document having anything to do with the Kennedy assassination. So Congress empowered the Citizens Board to do that. But fortunately, they took a very broad view of their task and included the political and diplomatic context, as they called it. In other words, what I call the real government conspiracies, conspiracies involving presidents, the CIA, State Department, Pentagon, in trying to overthrow other countries' governments.
Church Committee in the mid-'70s, of course, got into this.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this point once more for our listeners. The information that you've gathered here is new. Historians are going to be going over your work now to see if they agree or disagree with it, or they can add to it. And that's really exciting that 60 years later, we're still digging up new, fresh information. As I often say, subject may be old, but the issues are fresh. In this case, the information is also fresh. And I neglected to mention, you're actually writing a book now, too, about the Kennedy tapes. Is there a title, working title?
Clandestine Camelot.
Clandestine Camelot.
It's going to focus on Operation Mongoose and the Diem coup, which were Kennedy's 2 signature covert operations.
Mongoose was the Cuban government.
Yes, the attempt that failed to overthrow the communist government of Cuba.
Okay, and we already talked about Diem. We're going to get more of him in a moment, and I mentioned your other books, Fatal Politics and Chasing Shadows. All right, now. All right, who was Ngo Dinh Diem? Last name is spelled D-I-E-M. It is pronounced Diem. South Vietnam's president. How did he come into that position and when?
Diem was a product of the French colonial system. Vietnam had been a French colony for many years, and it worked with a combination of French colonial administrators and Vietnamese who worked with the colonial government. And Diem, from a young age, trained to be part of the civil service. And as a fairly young man in his 30s, he became Minister of the Interior under the Emperor Bao Dai, who was, the figurehead emperor.
Yes.
The French held all the cards and had all the power. And Diem, once he realized that he was not going to have much power as a minister, resigned. He's
Went to America, right?
He went to America eventually, but that was a while off.
Okay.
For a while, the Japanese controlled Vietnam during World War II. And once they surrendered, the communists under Ho Chi Minh, then organized as the Viet Minh, which we later renamed the Viet Cong, took over in 1945 and took Diem captive. But it wasn't to keep him as a prisoner, it was to persuade him to become part of their government. They wanted a Catholic constituency. And Diem and his family had a fairly a good reputation among the colonial auxiliary, the Vietnamese colonial workers.
Yeah.
But Diem refused, and he got out, and he went into self-imposed exile. So while the Viet Minh were struggling with the French to liberate Vietnam, at least from being a colony, Diem was out of the country in the United States or Japan or France, where he became a noted anti-communist. He had a Catholic constituency in America. Justice William O. Douglas, Senator Mike Mansfield, and Senator John F. Kennedy all thought, well, he might make a good anti-communist leader. So eventually the French lost their colony in 1954.
Battle of Dien Bien Phu was the final straw there.
Yeah, and
of course the United States had been backing and bankrolling the French war effort.
Yes, that was how we first got involved, and we were paying for the French effort and for the French colonial government, and that would become a key factor in the power that President Eisenhower and President Kennedy had over South Vietnam, since the United States paid most of the government's bills.
Yeah. Really, this story may start with FDR's death, because he opposed colonialism.
He did.
Harry Truman also did, but not as vehemently as FDR. So after World War II ends, the surrender in August of 1945, you mentioned how Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, they declare independence. Ho Chi Minh even cites Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence when he declares independence for Vietnam. But the French want to try to reestablish colonial authority. Mm-hmm. They finally lose that awful war in 1954. So this is during the middle of the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower just doesn't want to quote unquote, hand Indochina over to the communists. Correct. Indochina is now 3 countries today: Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. So he gets behind Diem.
Yeah, who was, I think, prime minister under Emperor Bao Dai.
And this is where Vietnam is partitioned.
Vietnam is partitioned. The north is where the communists regroup under Ho Chi Minh. The south is where the French and their Vietnamese auxiliaries regroup. And originally there was supposed to be, under the Geneva Accords, a Vietnam-wide election. But Diem refused to take part in that. He said because the communists have not held any, free and fair elections. But also, he knew he would not win.
Ho Chi Minh probably was the most popular, definitely was the most popular individual in Vietnam at that time. He probably would have won the election.
Yeah, despite his communism,
yes.
The attitude toward communism in Vietnam was very different from the attitude here in America.
So he was also a nationalist as well.
He was a nationalist who had definitely fought for his country's independence. And one of the ironies of Vietnamese history was that South Vietnam owed its independence from France to the communists in North Vietnam.
That's right. Yeah, so this partition happens at the 17th parallel. These are inventions. There's no such thing as a North Vietnam and South Vietnam until 1954. There are no elections, as we mentioned, because of the fear that the communists would have won. And our man in Saigon was Ngo Dinh Diem. He becomes the autocratic leader of South Vietnam and an American ally to prevent it from becoming a communist state. And Ho Chi Minh is in charge in the north. Okay, So we get to John F. Kennedy, 1961. He inherits this policy on South Vietnam, or Vietnam. I want to talk about continuities and structures, but one thing that's frustrating, at least from my perspective today, is that Kennedy, the candidate, had a different or more subtle view of wars of national liberation movements post-World War II than, say, Eisenhower. Right? He had some respect for people's attempts to establish independence from colonialism. He even was in Vietnam in the 1950s, where he kind of concluded, this is not a war for us to fight.
John F. Kennedy, like other senators and even, members of the Eisenhower administration, realized that colonialism was a losing proposition. All the empires were being broken up in the post-World War II environment. Everybody wanted independence. And we recognized that South Vietnam needed independence in order, for the people to rally against the communists. But at the same time, South Vietnam never really had independence because it was utterly dependent on American aid for its survival. We paid for most of their military effort and most of their government budget. And that meant that while in name, South Vietnam was a democratic government elected by the people, in reality, it was an authoritarian government, and American presidents could choose who ran South Vietnam.
Because of the aid weapon.
Yes. In 1954, the first coup attempt against Diem started organizing under the Army Chief of Staff, a General Hen. And he said he could have overthrown the government easily, except the United States told him, if you overthrow Diem, we are going to withdraw all of our aid. And he said, well, there would be no South Vietnam if they did that.
That's right.
So Eisenhower was able to thwart a coup just by threatening to withdraw American aid.
Yeah, I mean, the generals often were not happy with Diem. I say Diem, you say Diem, that's okay.
You pronounce it a little bit better.
Yeah. Because, I mean, the whole idea was to stop the insurgency that had started to build up in the late 50s and explodes in the early 1960s, which was the Viet Cong by then, calling them the Viet Cong, in South Vietnam, because the communists wanted to unify the country under communist rule. And Diem lacked legitimacy in the countryside. He was basically the mayor of Saigon, you might want to call him. Maybe that's an exaggeration. His regime lacked legitimacy in the countryside with the peasantry, but that doesn't mean the peasantry wanted to live under a Marxist authoritarian state either. Right, so there's that dynamic.
Yeah, that's very true. I think the main strength that the communists had wasn't communism, it was nationalism. It was an agrarian country.
Yes.
So, and communism is built for industrial societies. But nationalism was very, very strong in these former French colonies because nobody wants to be. The first definition of freedom for a lot of countries is freedom from foreign domination.
That's right. And the Viet Minh, now the Viet Cong, had spilled their blood fighting the French, while Diem was
not in the country.
Not in the country at that point. So I said Kennedy inherits this policy, and I mentioned that as a candidate, he was a pretty keen observer of the international arena, right?
We got, sorry.
Go ahead.
In Kennedy, we've got two things. We've got one, a Cold War skeptic who really does sense that we don't have to get involved in a lot of international struggles, and that we're better off if we don't. He's very reluctant to intervene in Cuba, but Kennedy, the politician, knows that rattling the saber and taking a very tough Cold War stance makes him more popular. We were talking about this a little bit before.
Yeah. So the 60 election.
Yeah, the 60 election. In August of 1960, Kennedy was 6 points behind Nixon. And he turned to this political consulting firm known as Simulmatics, which claimed to use the computers of the era to do computer simulations of how the voters would react if you try different tactics. And in August, they say to Kennedy, like, the top three issues are all foreign affairs. It's who can be the strongest in negotiations with Russia, who can make sure that we are scientifically and economically competitive, and who is going to make sure that our missiles are strong enough and numerous enough to deter Russia. And they trust Nixon more than you. They trust Eisenhower's vice president more than a senator from Massachusetts. So what they recommend to him is you have to launch an aggressive partisan attack on the Republican foreign affairs record. Now, in retrospect, we look at the Eisenhower years as a time when America had this unparalleled power.
The missile gap.
Right.
Yeah, but Kennedy said there was a missile gap in the Soviets' favor. It was quite the opposite.
It was quite the opposite. We had like a 20-to-1 advantage in that. And the day after Simulmatics gives him this report saying you got to do an aggressive partisan attack, Kennedy declares Cuba to be an enemy of the United States. He says they will stop at nothing to bring about our destruction. And the reporters were like, are you sure you wanted to call him an enemy? And he says, yes, I mean it. And this was the most, this is the greatest denunciation that any prominent American politician had made of Cuba up to that point. And it starts working. I mean, when we think about
Eisenhower soft on communism, that's something.
Yes,
yeah.
But somehow this works. Yeah. When we think about the 60 campaign, we remember three things. We remember the debates, the religious issue, and the importance of the black vote in the cities. But Cuba, when you look at the debates, Kennedy hijacked the first one, which was supposed to be about domestic policy, and turned it into a partisan aggressive attack on Republican foreign policy.
Wow.
When he did his speech on religious freedom before the Houston ministers, he said, I have to talk about this, but we should be talking about the threat of Cuba. And the black vote in the cities made the difference in the end in a very close election, but it wasn't a close election until Kennedy started hammering Nixon and Eisenhower on Cuba. So he comes out of that election knowing that those attacks work, and knowing that if he can succeed by blaming the Republicans for losing Cuba in '60,
Revolution.
Yeah, the Castro Revolution in '59.
Yeah.
If he can blame that, if he can win an election by pinning that on the Republicans, then the Republicans can win the '64 election by pinning the loss of Vietnam on him.
That's right. And of course, it was Eisenhower who started planning his administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the idea that Eisenhower was somehow losing or going to lose Cuba when he's actually planning an illegal invasion, covert operation that Kennedy, of course, then picks up. Yeah, this idea of continuities and structures is important because, as you've just explained, and as I mentioned before, Kennedy did have a different or more subtle approach to what was then called the Third World. I guess it's the global South today. But at the same time, he was a Cold Warrior. He was an anti-communist. He subscribed to domino theories, or psychological domino theories. There's a subtle difference between those two things. He also bought into notions of credibility, national credibility, personal credibility. You just mentioned how he was worried about being painted himself as soft on communism or just inexperienced and young and naive. I mean, that was an attack that was made against him. And I guess what I'm thinking about here is what one of my old Ithaca College politics professors used to tell me. Naeem Inaitala is his name. He just retired, actually. He said, this is, think of an airplane as the ship of state, and the new pilot gets into the cockpit and he wants to steer the ship of state in the way he thinks it needs to go, and he thinks he's actually in control. But then all these other currents and fortresses start buffeting the plane, and the plane continues to head in the same direction as his predecessor, and he feels now constrained in his decision making. It's another way of saying that once you're in charge, you're not a candidate anymore. And you sit down with your advisors and they say, well, now that you're president, we've got to let you know that we have all these things happening in this country. We've got all this going on over in this country. Oh, and you're now inheriting 3 administrations worth of support for South Vietnam. And there's this guy named Diem. So now you own the problem.
Yes.
And of course, in addition to all the ideological things I mentioned too about domino theories and anti-communism.
And his rhetoric kind of boxed him in. Like, even though he knew that we didn't have to invade Cuba, that we could coexist with Cuba's communist government, he knew if he just said that we accept it, then 64 a Nixon or a Barry Goldwater would say, the President of the United States said he accepts a communist government 90 miles off our shore. And, that...
Republicans did that to Democrats. They did it to Truman.
As Democrats
China.
did it to Republicans.
Yes, and vice versa, yeah. Sorry to interject there, but...
no, it's true.
And even when it came to Vietnam, we're going to eventually get to the coup here.
Yeah.
This is how, my meandering interview style by now, Ken Hughes.
Setting the foundation.
Yeah. Even there, Kennedy understood that Vietnam was of peripheral national security interest to the United States. It was not a vital one. It was peripheral. That doesn't mean it was of no interest to us or that he was ready to give it up. So he comes to office in January 1961. He gives that soaring inaugural address. I got to stop waving my papers around here. But I don't know if he had a teleprompter. He probably had his papers in front of him on that freezing cold day in January in Washington. But he gives a soaring address in which he again talks about respecting the developing world and we'll be there for you as you throw off the yoke of colonialism. Vietnam was not at the top of his priority list in January of '61, but it eventually does come to his attention. When did JFK and his closest advisors, McNamara and the others, Maxwell Taylor, start to have serious concerns about Diem, meaning this guy might not be the right man to defeat the communist insurgency?
Pretty early on. And you can actually trace those concerns back even to the Eisenhower administration. There were always concerns that Diem couldn't rally the public of South Vietnam to fight the communists, that he didn't really have a great base of support there, that he was very autocratic, that he wasn't doing the things necessary to broaden the base of support for the government, things like land reform. And
those are legitimate criticisms.
Those are legitimate criticisms. But the mistake that was being made at the time was they were blaming Diem for a fault that was the entire South Vietnamese government's. Once they got rid of Diem, those faults would continue.
Of course.
Because the government was built on American foreign aid. It's not built on South Vietnamese support.
And Diem was his own man as well. He obviously knew how dependent he was on American aid and military support. There were, by the time of Kennedy's death, 16,000 military advisors in the country. He actually chafed at that. He wanted some of them to leave because the larger the American presence, the less authority it looked like he had. But Diem was his own man as well. He wasn't just a puppet. He was able to assert himself, and that also, I think, probably rankled people in Washington.
He had what they call agency. He and his family, I think, while they had very little, their power was constrained by their dependence on American aid and the constant threat of the communists, who did have enough power to take over the government in the absence of American support. But they did have a great deal of, I think, tactical acumen.
Yeah.
They knew what they were doing strategically, and they were able to play, I think, American politics fairly well, because whenever the U.S. government pressured them to reform or to change their ways, they would just argue that the U.S. government was falling for the propaganda of the communists, and that they had to take repressive measures in order to fight a dastardly enemy. And this kind of rhetoric did work.
Diem did some crackdowns on communists.
Yes. And also crackdowns on non-communists who
we'll get to the Buddhist crisis.
Who criticized his regime.
Yeah, to the point about when did the Kennedy people start to have serious concerns about Diem. You mentioned that they preceded Kennedy's administration, but I'll give you one example here. October of 1961, so Kennedy's in office for just 10 months. He sends Maxwell Taylor to tour Vietnam. Taylor then recommends a troop deployment to save the situation. Kennedy is opposed to this. Yes. But during this debate, Dean Rusk, who is the Secretary of Defense, if I'm correct, said a deployment would tie Washington's fate to Diem, who he referred to as a losing horse, quoting Mark Silverstone's book that I actually have over here called The Kennedy Withdrawal. You know Mark Silverstone. He's a colleague of yours, right?
Yes, he worked on these transcripts. We were co-editors.
Great. His book's a terrific book, The Kennedy Withdrawal. So even there, it looks like Diem's not going to save the day. So why don't we get to 1963 then, and something called the Buddhist crisis. Diem had a brother who was head of his security services, or secret police, Ngo Dinh Diem, and Ngu's wife, Madame Ngo, she was something else. She was mocking the Buddhists as they were lighting themselves on fire, self-immolation, to protest the repression of the Diem regime. What was going on in the Buddhist crisis of 1963, and how did that influence Kennedy's decision-making?
The Buddhist crisis started out as a protest of religious discrimination in Hue, the old imperial capital, which was under the thumb of another brother of Diem, Ngo Dinh Diem. And basically, the government there allowed Catholics to wave their flags during their parades, but not Buddhists to do the same. And it was genuine discrimination.
Yeah, and just to note here, Vietnam's overwhelmingly a Buddhist country.
Yes.
And the autocrat in South Vietnam is a Catholic, the religion of the colonizer, the French. But go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Buddhists protest, and one of the protests becomes bloody. The government forces kill some of the protesters. And what starts out as a protest against religious discrimination becomes a much broader protest of the entire authoritarian regime. And it becomes a worldwide scandal, partly for the way that Diem reacts, which is very autocratically, using police state methods and mass arrests. Also for the things that Madame Ngo says, such as, if there's another Buddhist barbecue, I will clap my hands. And that was, she was always making these politically incendiary comments.
Because there's some famous photos taken at that time. This is the era of mass communication. We don't have the internet, but a self-immolating
Yes.
Buddhist monk.
Yes.
I think it was an AP photographer maybe who caught that famous photo. I mean, that's seen all over the world. Yes, and then Madame Ngo is mocking it as a Buddhist barbecue.
Yeah, and the conscience of the world is really shocked. The self-immolation was something the rest of the world had not seen. And even, people, even Robert McNamara said we had to take this seriously, this moral witness against the South Vietnamese government, because it had taken such a drastic and dramatic step.
So you add the Buddhist crisis onto the list of issues that are troubling the Kennedy administration about Diem. So here's our first real hinge point in the story. Finally, we're getting there. It's impossible to do this job without a whole bunch of papers. So I'm going through the transcripts that you've produced, and also a wonderful essay you've written about this whole affair. So for people like me, so I don't have to go back and listen to all the tapes myself. August 15th, 1963. So we're still 3 months away from the actual coup. Kennedy sits down with Henry Cabot Lodge, his Republican foe. He beat him in a Senate race a few years before that, 8 years before that, 10 years before that. He's about to send Lodge to South Vietnam to be the new U.S. ambassador. And they sit down, like I said, it was August 15th, 1963. What do they talk about? Why is this important?
Kennedy chose Henry Cabot Lodge to be his ambassador to South Vietnam for the crisis for a couple of reasons. One, political cover. Lodge was a very prominent Republican, and things were going bad in South Vietnam. And this was one way to make the Republicans own it as much as the Democrats. Also, Lodge was, Kennedy admired Lodge. As a young man, he thought Lodge was just the kind of senator he wanted to be before he took Senator Lodge's job in 1952, when Lodge spent less time on his own Senate re-election campaign and more time trying to elect Dwight Eisenhower, and became a very big part of the Eisenhower administration as UN ambassador. Lodge was a Boston Brahmin, an old-style patrician, but sincere. He quit the Senate to fight in World War II. He didn't have to do that, but he did. And he has a name that every American school child has to learn, because he's named after his grandfather, the first Henry Cabot Lodge, who I think was the first American PhD in history, and also just a very notorious imperialist. We all have to learn that he was the guy who killed the League of Nations under
That's right.
Woodrow Wilson.
A family that was a force in politics, no doubt.
Yes.
Yeah, so this August 15th meeting, 1963, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., is how I should refer to him, is talking to Kennedy before he's about to be sent to South Vietnam. And Lodge had been speaking to Madame Ngu's mother,
Yes,
who expresses some real concerns to her about what's going on.
Yeah, Lodge, ordinarily when presidents' aides are very ginger about raising the subject of assassination. But Lodge gets straight to it. He had met the night before with Madame Ngu's parents. Her dad was the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States for 9 years, for the entire history of the South Vietnamese government, until he resigned in protest during the Buddhist crisis. He was protesting Diem's repressions, even though he was a relative of Diem.
That's amazing.
And his wife was a South Vietnamese representative to the UN, and she resigned as well. They were both highly critical of their daughter, but when they spoke to Lodge, they said, the mother told him, they're going to get assassinated. Diem, Ngo, my daughter. That's going to happen unless you can convince them to mend their ways or get out of Vietnam.
Out of the country. Kennedy is silent.
Kennedy, on the subject of assassination, is at first completely silent. He doesn't say anything about it. And that's important because Kennedy has the power to either save Diem and Ngu's lives or to leave them to their fate at the hands of the coup plotters. So at first he's silent, and Lodge raises the issue a second time. And that's when Kennedy responds with what sounds like a non sequitur to our ears in the 21st century. He says, "Is Madame Ngo a lesbian?"
Yeah, I actually have the transcript here. This is bizarre.
It does sound bizarre to us.
Yeah, Lodge goes, or says, but if they all get assassinated, then you're going to have to, Kennedy, yeah. Then you're really going to have to be on top of it all. Meaning kind of this is going to be a real bad problem if Diem is shot and killed or whatever, and we're going to own this. And then Kennedy says, well, what about Madame Ngo? Is she a lesbian or what? She seems like an awfully masculine woman.
Yes.
And the Lodge responds, I got to get my paper straight here. Lodge responds, well, I think she's probably a lesbian. And then Kennedy kind of acknowledges that. Lodge says, I think she was also very promiscuous, sort of a nymphomaniac too.
People loved gossiping about Madame Ngo, but I don't think this was gossip. I don't think JFK was changing the subject. If you look at early 1960s pop culture, there's this real strong link between homosexuality and violent death. Yeah, I mean, in movies, homosexuality was still a crime at that point, and crime could not pay. And so in movies that featured homosexual characters, they'd either die at somebody else's hands or at their own hands. And that was, I think, I don't want to read too much into it. You can't say that Kennedy is giving him a signal that it's okay. But we should note that he definitely did not say anything that suggested that Lodge should try to save her life or Diem's or Ngu's. And that's the first of what would become a consistent pattern of silence on the subject of assassination, so even when it's raised with them.
Yeah, so let's pause the narrative here because we're up in mid-August 1963. I mean, as a historian and as a researcher, how do you interpret silence on a subject? It's difficult. You know, tapes are great. They do offer irrefutable evidence of what people said at that moment, but it's not the entire picture.
Right. We have to look at all the instructions that JFK gave Henry Cabot Lodge. And
after the meeting,
at the meeting and after,
okay.
every all of them, and there are not at any time any instructions to preserve the lives of Diem and Ngo or any member of the Ngo family. There's no instruction to make sure that the coup plotters give them safe passage out of the country. And as I'm sure you'll bring up, there are times when the coup plotters, the main coup plotter, Big Min, brought up assassination himself.
That's a little bit later. At this early meeting, a coup is kind of just an abstract possibility, but not regime change.
Right.
Kennedy does say he's okay if the circumstances warrant it. He'd be okay with replacing Diem, not necessarily violently. I mean, he had the aid weapon, right?
He did have the aid weapon, and he was contemplating a coup, but he said he wanted Lodge to go there and make an assessment before JFK made a decision, that he would change his mind pretty soon.
Okay. Well, in that same conversation, I'll try to do a better job of reading these transcripts.
You're doing great.
Kennedy says, "I don't know whether we'd be better off," meaning without Diem. "Whether the alternative would be better, maybe it will be. If so, then we have to move in that direction. But I think I'd like to take a good look at it before I come to that conclusion." So nothing decided here in August.
Right.
But then we get to Cable 243. This is a fairly well-known aspect of this drama that you shed some new light on. Lodge goes to South Vietnam. To make a long story a little bit less long, Lodge goes to South Vietnam in August, and he sees the situation's a disaster. He sends a cable to Washington about the fact that there are people in South Vietnam who would be happy to see Diem out of the way. Here's actually the cable, or this is not Cable 243. This is the one that Lodge sends back to Washington from Saigon. A suggestion's been made that the U.S. only has to give the nod, or only has to indicate to generals that would be happy to see Diem or the news go, and the deed would be done. But Lodge says, "Don't do this. Action on our part in these circumstances would seem to be a shot in the dark." So Lodge is in South Vietnam. He's made aware that some generals want to get rid of Diem. He tells Washington, "Let's not go ahead with this." That cable arrives in Washington, and what happens?
A scene worthy of a conspiracy thriller that I would love to see, turned into a movie or a prestige television series.
There's always a chance for that. There's a lot of TV out there.
It's Saturday, August 24th, 1963. The New Frontiers Top Guns are out of town. JFK is in Hyannisport. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara is in the Tetons. The CIA director, John McCone, is at his estate in San Marino, California. And Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, is at a Yankees game. And at that point, the highest ranking U.S. official in the State Department is Undersecretary of State George Ball, and he is getting in a golf game. And he sees two other second-level State Department guys, Undersecretary of State Averell Harriman and Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, who's the guy in charge of Vietnam, Roger Hilsman, show up at the golf course, and they want his help in approving a coup d'etat in South Vietnam.
And these second and third tier officials, while fairly high up, they're not the deciders on this.
They're not. They, Michael Forrestal, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor, sends a draft cable up to JFK in Hyannisport and says, "Look, we want to give this okay to a coup." What we're basically saying is, we will, if Diem doesn't get rid of Madam New and New, if he doesn't get them out of the country, then we can't support him any longer with American aid. And
why would we want to get rid of his brother and his brother's wife?
Because they were looked at as sort of the evil geniuses of the Diem regime. I don't think that's fair. I think what they did were things that Diem wanted them to do, and they did them with his approval. But America had been boosting Diem for so many years that it was hard to publicly acknowledge that.
So maybe if we get rid of these other people. So Cable 243 then, with the second and third tier Kennedy administration officials, with JFK, although they did let him know about this, but he's not in town.
He's not in town. He doesn't hold any meetings with his advisors about it. He doesn't talk with any of his top guys. He just says, well, if you can get the top civilian available at the Pentagon to clear it, then you can go ahead and send it.
That's amazing to think that Kennedy was that, what's the word, lackadaisical kind of.
No, I think he was, it makes sense to me if he thought there has to be a coup to end the Buddhist crisis and put this issue on the back burner for the 1964 election. And he would have been better off if it happened while he was out of town and everybody else was out of town, because it would have been, it would be extremely controversial politically in America, because Diem's had a lot of support. And it would have been controversial within his own administration, because he was betraying an ally.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this was an American ally, which is different than some of the previous coups under the Eisenhower administration, where we toppled perceived enemies or people who just didn't want to go along with the American so-called world order in that early juncture of the Cold War. But not to digress about that yet. So Kennedy kind of greenlights this idea. Cable 243 is sent back to Lodge, quietly informing him, I'm actually quoting your work here, quietly informing key South Vietnamese generals that if Diem fails to resolve the political crisis, release the Buddhist prisoners, and remove, as you mentioned, his brother and his sister-in-law from the scene, then the U.S. would find it impossible to continue to support Saigon military and economically. In other words, if you want to get rid of him, go right ahead.
Yes.
You know, maybe the generals in the abstract could have gotten rid of Diem on their own. But the reality is they always consulted, it seemed, with the United States through all of this. Shortly after this cable is sent, though, Kennedy says, wait a second, we better actually start thinking about this. And here's the second major meeting, August 28th, 1963. Kennedy asks about the fate of Diem and his brother. Why is this meeting, late August 1963, important in this story?
What happened was, as soon as the bigwigs got back in town, they were extremely angry, especially the Pentagon. Secretary of Defense McNamara and JCS Chairman Taylor both were strongly against a coup d'etat. Not that they thought Diem was a great leader, but that they thought there's no replacement on the horizon. There's nobody in the South Vietnamese military who shows any sort of indication of being a better leader. So Kennedy has to have these kind of tense meetings with his top advisors who are split down the middle. Most of the guys at the top of the Pentagon and the CIA oppose a coup. And
yeah, McNamara was against it.
McNamara was against it.
John
was
McCone
against it.
was
John
against
McCone was against
CIA
it.
chief.
CIA director.
Yeah.
And most of the top people at the State Department and in the National Security Council, especially McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, who is very influential with JFK, very highly respected by JFK, they were in favor of a coup. And so they spend the week arguing it out. And by Wednesday, that's the first time Kennedy brings up the safety of Diem and Ngo. And he says, I don't know if you want to read it.
Let's see. I don't know if I have the exact quote right in front of me, but go ahead. Yeah.
He says, what's going to happen to them? We want them to get out of the country safely if we have any say in it. And so that's the strongest piece of evidence that he wanted them to be safe. But when we look at that in the context of all the cables he was sending to South Vietnam, he never turns that into any instruction to Henry Cabot Lodge or to the CIA in Saigon. And the CIA is conducting all the contacts with the South Vietnamese generals.
On the day of this meeting or the day after, the CIA approaches a South Vietnamese general. You were about to say something before I get to this next thing. If you want me to move on to this, I can.
Well, just that there's no instruction to tell the generals, hey, give Diem and Ngo safe passage out of the country. They have served America, maybe not well, but loyally. And, you know, we owe them at least their physical safety.
Could have been done at any point during this story.
Right.
Any point, all this month-long deliberating over what to do about South Vietnam. Kennedy could have said, whatever happens, don't touch a hair on his head.
So the CIA approaches General Duong Van Minh, who is known as Big Min.
Big Min.
Because he's 6 feet tall and he's just under 200 pounds, I think. And most people in Vietnam are not that big. His other major physical characteristic is he has only one tooth, because the Japanese tortured him by prying out his teeth during World War II. He's the general with the biggest stature, in metaphorically as well as physically, in Vietnam.
Described as close to an authentic hero as South Vietnam has right now, according to the New York Times.
According to the New York Times.
They were aware. So the CIA approaches Min to say, okay, if you want to get rid of Diem.
So they ask him if he's interested in overthrowing the government. Now, Big Min doesn't know whether the CIA is serious or whether they're working for Ngo, because the CIA is very tight with Ngo. since he was the regime's.
So they could be entrapping him.
Yeah,
right?
they could be entrapping him. They could just be identifying generals for Ngo to put in prison. And so the CIA has actually asked him, how can we prove we're serious? How can the U.S. government prove to you that it's serious? And he says, oh, that's easy. Just cut off aid to the Diem regime. That will prove that the United States wants the government replaced.
Okay. So here we are in late August. Kennedy's position is yes on a coup if circumstances require it. On assassination, he's not for it, but he's not necessarily saying don't do it.
Right.
Which is he's wavering.
He's put himself on the classified record as against it, but he has not followed through.
Okay.
He's still with regard to all the key people in Saigon, Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador, the CIA folks there, and especially the generals. They are not getting any indication that assassination is forbidden, that it's not allowed.
Kennedy does suspend aid to the Diem regime in early October 1963. We mentioned how the CIA approaches Big Min at the end of August. In early October, Min comes back to the CIA and says, okay, now it's time to get rid of Diem. We have this. We have three options available. Which one do you prefer? So you want to talk a little bit about what those options were and how the Kennedy administration responded to those.
Okay, Big Min meets secretly with a CIA agent named Lucien Conein, and he says, I now represent a cabal, a coalition of South Vietnamese generals. We're willing to overthrow the government, but we absolutely have to know what the U.S. position is on that.
Yeah, we stick our neck out. We need to know if you're behind us.
Right. We need to know that you won't thwart us the way they thwarted the coup plot against Diem in 1954.
Yeah,
under Eisenhower. And we need to know that our regime will get American aid, the same as Diem. Now, these are essential requirements for any South Vietnamese government because the South Vietnamese government is completely dependent on American aid. He mentions a dollar figure, $1.5 million a day in American aid. That's what keeps South Vietnam afloat.
That's amazing.
And he says, we've got three alternative plans to overthrow the government. One of them is to assassinate Ngo and another brother, Con, who's like the warlord in Hue, central Vietnam, but keep Diem around. And he says that's the easiest coup plot to accomplish. Doesn't really say how Diem will react.
Yes, to losing his brother.
After how he'll treat the people who murdered his brothers. Yeah. But Conein apparently didn't ask him about that. The other two plans were to encircle Saigon militarily with rebel forces, or to have street-by-street block fighting between the rebel forces and the loyalist forces in Saigon.
The assassination plot is kind of the easiest of all those three.
It's the easiest, and when Conein gets back to Saigon Station, the acting chief of station, Dave Smith, it happens to be his first day as acting chief of station, sends CIA headquarters a summary of Big Min's coup plot, which immediately goes to the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House. So Kennedy has a copy of it as well, laying out the three alternatives. And Dave Smith says, I recommend we do not set ourselves irrevocably against assassination because the other alternatives would lead to a bloodbath.
Yeah, he had a problem with some of the details of Big Min's plan, but at the same time he said these other ones aren't very, these alternatives aren't.
He said it wasn't realistic to kill two of Diem's brothers and keep Diem around.
Yes.
Ho Chi Minh had killed one of Diem's brothers and had made him into an enemy for life.
Yes. So another key piece of context here in October of 1963, the war is going badly from the Americans' perspective.
It's not clear yet to the Pentagon that the war is going badly, and it won't become clear until after the coup.
Interesting.
The Pentagon still thinks that the war is going fairly well.
Can be salvaged at the very least.
Yeah, but Kennedy thinks that there's no way that the political crisis can remain contained in the cities. He thinks it's going to spill off And he's worried that it'll get much, much worse in '64.
An election year.
Election year. And then he'll have like a big problem. I mean, his two big fears were that, one, he'd have to send in American troops to save it. And that did not happen until '65, or completely withdraw. And then the problem would be that the communists would take over. And that would be a problem for America's credibility in the world, and right, particularly for his credibility in America as an anti-communist. Again, you know, if he can win the '60 election by hammering Eisenhower and Nixon for losing Cuba, where Americans weren't even fighting, then the Republicans could hammer him in '64 for losing Vietnam.
Yeah, as historian Frederick Logevall has argued, I think convincingly, credibility was higher up on the causal hierarchy, if you don't mind me using that term, than domino theories. I mean, Kennedy never totally divorced himself of domino thinking, but the idea of credibility, especially for Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, personal credibility, was higher up on the list here as far as driving the American commitment to Vietnam. What would our allies think if we give up on one of our allies? Or give up on Saigon is what I'm trying to say. So we were talking. Oh, and also I wanted to mention about how the war was going, the issue of whether the war is going well or poorly. Mark Silverstone, in his book, The Kennedy Withdrawal, talks about all the different reports that are hitting Kennedy's desk at this time, most of which say we need to salvage this, or we can salvage this, as bad as the situation is. Very few, if any, at this point are telling the president we need to get out of there entirely. Right. So, you know, he doesn't want to give up on Saigon.
He's hearing that from some people in the Senate, but it's nowhere near a majority yet.
Yeah. We also have to remember that most Americans didn't want the U.S. to cut and run from Vietnam, even though they don't understand the war. It's not something that we do.
They were being told that it was going okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's another important point. They weren't getting always very accurate information from what were called official sources in those days.
They were being told that Diem was an overwhelmingly popular leader. Up until the evidence of the Buddhist crisis showed that he was widely opposed.
Interesting. All this context is so important. Context is critical. Okay, so the key meeting here, October 8th, 1963. We talked about how Big Min approaches the administration with these three different plans. One of them involves assassination, although not of Diem himself. Kennedy holds an off-the-record roundtable conference at the White House, citing your work here, to consider how they should reply to Big Min's plans. No written records of the meeting have emerged. The American people would have no record of this discussion had it not been secretly tape recorded, and it had not been for my colleague here, Ken Hughes, and his editors transcribing it for the
record. And Ken Germany.
That's right, Mark Silverstone. We got to give everybody credit here. Kennedy doesn't record the entire meeting. Begins at 5:30 that night, continues till around 6:15. So it's not a very long meeting. He gets about 25 minutes. 25 minutes in this months-long drama. Mm-hmm. What's the gist of this meeting after Kennedy presses the record button? What is ultimately decided here?
The August 24th decision gets compared to the Bay of Pigs a lot. The October 8th decision, Kennedy's decision-making process is more like it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He hears from everybody who opposes the coup. He hears from Defense Secretary McNamara.
A lot of people at this meeting.
Yes. Okay. Defense Secretary McNamara speaks against JCS Chairman Taylor. McCone has prepared a response saying, let's tell our CIA guys to say we can't even bring your proposal to any responsible figures in the U.S. government until we have more information. It's basically a way of saying no without using the word no. But Kennedy, after having spent weeks hearing his aides debate it at numerous ExComm meetings, after sending more than one mission, fact-finding mission to South Vietnam, after exploring all of the issues, says, our position here is if he overthrows the government, okay. And if he doesn't, okay. The difference here is in August, we went and asked them to overthrow the government, and now we're not going to. He's deciding to give Big Min a green light, to tell him, yes, we will give the new regime American aid, we will not thwart your coup attempt.
So this is different than, say, what Eisenhower did with Patrice Lumumba in Congo, evidence indicating pretty decisive evidence, I think, or definitive evidence. Eisenhower ordered the murder of Lumumba in August of 1960. The CIA actually, not the ones who got to him, he was killed by his domestic rivals. In this case, it's the generals in South Vietnam coming to Kennedy saying, we want to do this, and he says, go ahead if you feel like you need to do it.
Yes. I should point out that on that tape, they don't discuss assassination at all. And when you read the cables, and the cables are super important, when Kennedy approves a response to Big Men's proposal, the proposal was explicit. Assassination is our first option, and it's the easiest. The reply that Kennedy gives them says to the CIA people in Saigon, we want information about their plans, but do not get drawn into reviewing or advising them.
The best line is no line.
Okay, that's
different cable. Okay.
That's a different cable.
Okay.
That's a very relevant cable because people want to know what Kennedy's silence on assassination means, and John McCone filled it out in the only explicit guidance that the CIA station in Saigon got on assassination, and it's a very important cable. It didn't come out in its entirety in the Church Committee report. And the Church Committee report is actually very, I think, misleading because it leaves out the first two sentences, which are basically, here is your guidance for assassination discussions. In general, the best line is no line. We're not in favor of assassination, but we're not going to try to stop assassination. Our approach is going to be hands off. We want all the information that the generals can give us, but we will not take any line. So, according to McCone's testimony,
in the Church Committee later.
Yes, in '75, yeah. Long after, he spoke with Kennedy about this, with President Kennedy about this, and he felt that Kennedy agreed, which basically removes plausible deniability. Now we have to make really specifically clear, it's not that Kennedy says it's okay to kill Diem. He's silent on the subject. He doesn't say it's not okay to kill Diem or anybody else. He's silent on the subject. But
he could have. If he wanted to, he could have told McCone, make it clear that if you kill Diem, you're not getting a penny of American aid, for instance.
Right. Yes, he could have made it a condition, and he chose not to. And unfortunately, we don't know why. He didn't say why. We can speculate, but we're just speculating.
It's amazing how you've been able to navigate cryptic language, silence, cables, bureaucratic kind of euphemism to understand what happened here.
Well, I think it would not have been completely clear without John McCone's testimony, which included the best line is no line cable, which really makes it very clear that the Kennedy administration left it up to the generals to decide. And William Colby.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but they knew that the generals had assassination on their mind.
They did. So. Yes, they were not. It's not like they never thought of this.
Yeah.
And Lodge had brought it up face to face with Kennedy. So Kennedy knew that assassination was a possibility. And Kennedy had brought it up himself at the August 28th ExComm meeting.
Okay. We're going to go ahead.
And Big Min had made it explicit.
Yes, Big Min wrote here's your menu of choices. That's right.
This is a conscious choice by President Kennedy not to take a position.
We're going to wrap up in a bit with the Kennedy mystique and what this story means for that. And of course, he was assassinated shortly after Diem is murdered. Oh, for the record, the actual coup does not happen until November 2nd, and Diem and his brother Ngo are shot to death by the plotters.
Shot and stabbed.
Shot and stabbed. I have high tech here. I'm going to play something off of my iPhone. This is available on YouTube, actually. November 4th, 1963, JFK, if he had an iPhone in those days, would have been talking into it the way I'm holding it up here. He reflects for the historical record on what had just happened. I want your interpretation of what this means.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge that causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility because Lodge shifted his station chief. Semicolon, in favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Barstow at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Diem and Ngo in order to move them.
That's his son entering the room there. I played 2.5 minutes of that. He does go on to say that he liked Diem, he had met Diem. Do you feel this is a president kind of trying to exonerate himself for what happened?
I want to put that in political context, because Monday, November 4th was when Clement Zablocki, who was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that handled Vietnam, stood up in the House and said that he was not satisfied with the administration's explanation for what had gone on. He thought that the aid cuts were a signal for a coup to take place, which wasn't exactly right, but was darned close. Yeah. And he said, if we did not insist on the safety of Diem, if we did not insist on safe passage for Diem, then we're responsible. So by Monday after the coup, Kennedy is facing, this is a brand new threat. This is a Democrat. This is one of Kennedy's most prominent supporters. He was, during the primaries of 1960, Kennedy said, I cannot win the nomination if I don't win Wisconsin. And he couldn't win it without Clement Zablocki, who had been the congressman. Yeah, there's this great documentary called Primary, and you can see Zablocki, he's introducing Kennedy. He holds this huge rally for Kennedy in Milwaukee right before the election. And he's really proud of that. He's a very fervent supporter of JFK, and he says, we broke the fire code to get extra people in there. And a few people fainted, but I think it was worth it. But he is angry on November 4th because he had spoken with Kennedy right before the coup, and he had said Kennedy had told him, I don't think Diem can hold on, and Zablocki said, if you support Diem, he'll hold on as long as you support him. If you withdraw your support, then there's going to be a coup. So Zablocki understood how power was working there. When I listened to Kennedy's dictabelt voice memo.
It's too bad he didn't have an iPhone. There'd be less crackling.
Yeah, there'd be less crackling. I think he's admitting things that people already know. Cable 243 had leaked to the New York Herald Tribune.
That's the August one.
Yeah, that's the August one.
Town, yeah.
And so he mentions that. He mentions also that he had approved it, which was something that hadn't leaked. So that is a substantial admission. But when he goes through, like when he's saying who's on what side of the coup, he leaves out two people whose position on the coup would indicate his. Secretary of State Dean Rusk did not allow any daylight between himself and the president on any foreign policy decision. And Rusk was a supporter of the coup. And another guy who was, compared to Robert Kennedy as sort of like the president's alter ego was McGeorge Bundy.
Interesting.
And he was also for the coup, and Kennedy just doesn't mention them.
He expresses some remorse, too, that Diem was killed.
He says he was shocked that Diem and Ngo were killed. I don't see how he could possibly have been shocked that Ngo was killed. And
the brother.
The brother,
yeah.
Especially since Big Min said that was plan A. And also, he had as much sense, JFK had as much sense as Dave Smith, the acting chief of station of the CIA, and had to realize that it was just unfeasible for them to murder Diem's brothers and leave Diem alive.
So before we wrap up with the Kennedy mystique issue, you've also done something here that's, I find, truly remarkable. You've been able to debunk, with your new information, the stories that have been out there and have been repeated in footnotes, in history books for decades. And we'll focus on one that's really important briefly here. Maxwell Taylor writes a memoir at some point saying that when Kennedy heard that Diem was killed and his brother, he storms out. There was a meeting going on. He storms out of the meeting. He's looking all distraught.
Shocked and dismayed.
It's a way of saying Kennedy had nothing to do with the assassination.
Yeah.
This was a fantasy.
This was a fabrication. It's a beautiful one, though. He sets the scene very dramatically. He says it's November 1st. It's at the XCOM meeting, the first after the coup starts. And we know that took place from 10 a.m. to 12:15. And somebody comes in with a cable saying that Diem and Ngo are dead. At that point, the story was that they had committed suicide. But Kennedy, of course, instantly realizes that that can't possibly be true, given their religious background. And he leaps to his feet and leaves the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face. And Maxwell Taylor says that that's because he had always insisted that Diem be unharmed.
And like, there's nothing in the record to suggest that.
Yeah. I told you before, my parents were scientists. They raised me the falsification principle. Scientists try to prove theories by disproving them. You haven't tested a theory until you've tried to prove it false. So when you see a historical claim or a theory, I try to prove it false. And the first thing I noticed was that during this XCOM meeting, Diem and Ngo were both alive. They had not died, and that there were no false reports that they had died. And then I looked for all the evidence that Kennedy had ever insisted on their safety. And there was only that one comment at the 28 August 1963 XCOM meeting, which in context is never turned into an instruction.
That's right. So we have the tapes of the meeting, but what matters is what was told to the people on the ground in Saigon.
Right.
And I think there was also a cable the day before the coup, or the coup's already underway, saying something about, well, maybe don't kill these guys, but at that point it was too late.
Right, yes, on the day of the coup, like when it's just a few hours, when Diem and Ngo just have a few hours to live. There's a State Department cable saying to Lodge, if we know that the generals are making their own decisions and they might not be open to your suggestions, but we'd like them to keep in mind safe passage for Diem and Ngo. I mean, it's a very mild suggestion.
The amazing thing about this Maxwell Taylor story, I mean, why wouldn't you believe it? Maxwell Taylor was a key decision maker, key player. He was there.
It's an eyewitness account.
Eyewitness account. Gets repeated, picked up by historians. As a reader of history, I also often read footnotes to see where certain things are coming from. You trust that they're accurate.
Yes.
It gives me pause. I don't want to overstate the case, but in this case, this is a story that what is it now? 60 years, total nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, he told the story first in the early 1970s, so it's been repeated
70s, okay.
for over 50 years in over 50 books. And these are not just minor books.
Oh,
They're
Robert Dallek wrote one.
Yeah, Pulitzer Prize winners have won them, professors of history, famous journalists, liberals and conservatives, both back this story. And there's no way it could possibly be true. And I go through all the different versions of it.
Yes.
Like Arthur Schlesinger, who was a Kennedy speechwriter as well as an historian, repeats the tale, but he takes off all the details that can prove it wrong, like the date and the time and the idea that.
And that's no small figure in historical
No,
scholarship.
he's huge.
Arthur Schlesinger.
He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes,
Yes.
and he was a Harvard professor of history.
Wow.
And then
Well, you've
McNamara.
corrected the record. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I hope so.
You
Yeah,
were saying McNamara. Yeah.
McNamara did his own bogus eyewitness account, switching it to November 2nd at the XCOM meeting on November 2nd morning, but that can't be true either because Kennedy would have read that Diem and Ngo were dead in the New York Times. He would have read it in his daily intelligence brief. The first cable had come through more than 10 hours earlier. And the MEMCON, the memo of the meeting, shows that his aides were discussing the deaths of Diem and Ngo before Kennedy arrived, and Kennedy brought up their deaths himself. And we can listen to him discuss it, and he's very calm.
Yeah.
He talks about the thing being bothersome, that they're...
He's a pragmatist in the recordings, right? He doesn't get emotional. He's a
very cool customer.
analytical thinker. So part of the Kennedy mystique is, had he only come back from Dallas alive after his trip there November 22nd, he might have pulled the United States out of Vietnam and our country would have avoided it. The Vietnamese people would have avoided that horrible war. What do you think of that before I move on to other aspects of the darker side of Camelot is what we're getting at here, but go ahead.
Well, I actually tie it into the darker side of Camelot because I think by the time he died, JFK had figured out how to get out of Vietnam. He seems to have understood it was a losing proposition. He only solved short-term problems by greenlighting the coup. That resolved the Buddhist crisis.
So that was not an indication of his commitment to Vietnam, getting rid of Diem. That was just a short-term
fix that would get South Vietnam off the front pages in '64. But he apparently discussed this with one of his closest and oldest aides, Kenny O'Donnell, and said, I can't get out now, but I can do it after I'm reelected, so we better make sure I'm reelected. And after I'm reelected and get out, I will be one of the least popular presidents in American history. He compared what would happen to him to the Joe McCarthy Red Scare, which was built around who lost China. And that was, of course, never ours to lose. But a lot of politicians, including young JFK, blamed the U.S. State Department for not giving the nationalist Chinese enough backing. And that was a very powerful political argument, though it doesn't make much sense in retrospect. It doesn't seem like a little more aid would have done it. But Kennedy, I think, was correct in predicting that if he got out of Vietnam in '65 and the communists took over, he would definitely be attacked for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory and sending American boys to die in vain. Because, by '63, about 100 already had died in Vietnam,
right.
even though they were not technically in combat.
Right. They were advisors.
They were being shot at.
Yes.
But he said they asked him how he would do it, and he said, easy, I'll just put in a government that will ask me to leave. And I think by learning about the Diem coup and the leverage that American aid gave American presidents over the South Vietnamese government, we can see how easily he could have done that. And it was still fairly obvious to the newspapers that the U.S. government was responsible for the coup, and it would have been even more obvious in '65, because that would have been a much more unpopular decision.
As you know, Frederick Logevall, a great Vietnam scholar, I think he's made the convincing case that Johnson had an opportunity to get the United States out of Vietnam and pay a minimal political price or a short-term political price that the American people would have eventually forgotten, because in the end, Vietnam was not a vital national security interest of the United States.
We see that now, but China,
Yes.
China was not a vital interest to the national security of the United States. After the communists took over China, America had the 1950s, a period of
Yes.
relative peace and prosperity, and of strength. And I think Fred, who was a great scholar, underestimates the level of political price that JFK or LBJ would have to pay in 1965, when his opponents would be able to say, "Hey, we wouldn't have had to do much to win the war in Vietnam. Just keep backing them, or stick with Diem," which is one of the arguments that some conservatives make in retrospect. I think it's a false argument. It's based on a fantasy that things would have worked out, but that fantasy is not politically ineffective.
True. Good leadership, though. You can go to the American people and say why we're doing this and for the reasons, and you can say, listen, there's going to be a problem after we leave. I'm not saying it's going to be, the Garden of Eden over there, but here are the negatives if we stay. Hypothetical, of course, but November 22nd, 1963, I was not alive. Of course, my parents were. They've told me, everyone remembers what they were doing or how they felt at that moment. People watching television at home in the afternoon had their soap operas or whatever it was interrupted, and Walter Cronkite breaks the news. You weren't alive either, but I'm sure your parents have talked to you about it. Kennedy, so young and full of vitality, and his beautiful family with these little children running around the White House after basically, 30 years of old men being president. FDR, Truman, grandfather Lee Eisenhower. Talking about Camelot, the Kennedy mystique. And when you die young and tragically, that's frozen. Right? That's Kennedy will always be young. And, he didn't have an opportunity to screw up his second term or make really bad mistakes that people would have remembered him for, because the first thing that comes to mind is he was assassinated. What are your thoughts on the Kennedy mystique and how it's had such staying power? I mean, people to this day get emotional when they think about the assassination.
I understand it. My parents both voted for JFK and thought he was the last presidential candidate that they could vote enthusiastically for. And, I grew up with him as a household hero. I think my parents had 3 Kennedy books. They had a bunch of them, but 3 really made an impact on me. Profiles in Courage, which is about the need for political leaders to demonstrate courage. The Making of the President in 1960, which is a very hagiographic account of Kennedy's election victory. And Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, which was written by Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers, and a journalist who was coincidentally named Joe McCarthy, oddly enough. And that's where the account of Kennedy's idea of how to get out of Vietnam comes from. And basically, both my books they're about those subjects: political courage versus political calculation, presidential politics, and how presidential politics affect decisions about foreign policy, to the detriment of American foreign policy. Very, very often with Nixon we saw very clearly, and to a lesser extent we see clearly with Johnson and Kennedy, that presidential electoral considerations played a role in their decisions about Vietnam. And
certainly with Nixon in the decent interval, but
yes,
not to digress about Tricky Dick, but
oh, please do.
But the Kennedy mystique has had a hold on us, and I guess what I'm trying to get at here is not to destroy him entirely, his reputation. There's the good and the bad. What I mentioned earlier, the continuities and the structural causation. Eisenhower had the coup in Iran in 53, Guatemala in 54, orders the assassination of Lumumba in 1960. Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs, and then Operation Mongoose. He and his brother seemed obsessed with trying to get rid of Castro. They even tried to hire mafia hitmen to kill Castro, poison his cigars, whatever it was. Then we have this in South Vietnam, where he greenlights the coup of an American ally, and the man winds up dead hours after he's toppled. I want people to think of these continuities and these structures rather than these images.
Yeah.
He can, or both, do both. You can do both. I mean, I was not alive in those years, so I never bought into the Kennedy mystique. But certainly the Reagan aura affected me as a young person. And as I've gotten to know more about Reagan's real record, I don't look at him the same way I did as when I was a teenager.
What we learn, it complicates things. All the presidents, even the best ones, have dark sides. Franklin Roosevelt and even Abraham Lincoln. And it's important for us, I think, like you say, and as an historian, I 100% endorse it. We need to learn more of what they're like as politicians and human beings, trying to lead a diverse and often contentious country that often a lot of people just don't pay much attention to these life or death issues until they become crises or catastrophes.
Yeah, and so it's important to also recognize, is what I'm trying to say, the weight of the structures too, because it's very easy for us to sit here, and I think we're probably right. The United States should not have green-lighted the coup of Diem, should not have gotten involved in Vietnam, should not have ordered the killing of Congo's first democratically elected leader. But when you're in the chair, right, you feel the weight of these structural causes and ideology, notions of personal credibility, national credibility, etc. It's just it's a way of putting yourself in their shoes, if that's possible.
And if we
to understand history rather than judge it, I guess is the way I'm trying to say.
And the better we understand them, the better we can, as citizens, lead them. The relationship is all not just president over citizen.
Yeah.
We have a great say as long as we exercise it and the direction of the government.
Yeah. Also, the problem with covert operations, it's undemocratic, right?
Yes.
It's unaccountable.
These are decisions made behind closed doors. I want to say everybody who is wedded to the idea that a president was overthrown in a coup in November of 1963, that was the result of a conspiracy at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Please check out our transcripts and the essay I wrote about the Diem coup to see how an actual international conspiracy that results in a coup and a presidential assassination.
MillerCenter.org, is that the website?
I believe
so well prepared.
I work there, and I think it's MillerCenter.org.
Well, there's that thing called Google. You can do Miller Center, Ken Hughes, Kennedy coup, and you'll find all the materials. Ken Hughes of the University of Virginia, author of Fatal Politics and Chasing Shadows. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our listeners for this special episode of History as It Happens.